So thank you to Corey for that introduction and those announcements, and thank you to the Kennedy Center for sponsoring this. I know I don't need to go over Mr. Bahar's bio because you've already read it, and that's why you're here, but I would just like to point out a few things. If I was to describe him, I think I would describe him as the modern Renaissance lawyer. His background is so diverse as compared to most people you might interact with, particularly in government. He's been in private practice. He has worked in the military and still is associated with the military as a reserve and done some very interesting things, as you read in his bio, with special operations folks in the military. So he's had a very interesting and unique aspect of that. Worked with the National Security Council and the executive, and now works on the Hill for the House Intelligence Committee. The breadth of that experience and the diversity of that experience is a testament not only to his skills and capabilities, but also is what makes him so interesting and what makes me look so forward to what he has to say, because he can answer your questions and bring us ideas from such a diverse set of background and set of experience that he has had. So, Michael, they are all yours.
Right. Thank you all very much. I guess today we are, a lot of lectures we're doing while I'm here. Yes, today is the truth, the classified truth behind Area 51 and the Kennedy assassination. Oh, this is tomorrow. Right. Something far more interesting, Congress and the intelligence community. How many people have heard the story, the myth, the legend of the Ring of Gyges? We had a half hand.
I don't remember any details about it.
What power did it give the person who put it on?
Invisibility.
Yes, that's the big one. So it comes from this great sort of dialogue with Plato, this Socratic dialogue, and somebody's talking about, well, what happens if you have this ring that makes you invisible? I like to think about it as Harry Potter's cloak instead. If you had this power to be invisible, what would you do? And I don't know if you remember, what did he say people would do if they had this power to be invisible?
I really don't remember it.
Well, what would you do? What would you, no, I wouldn't say what would you do. What would you think somebody did if they had the power to be invisible and they could do whatever they wanted without anybody seeing it?
They would do bad things very quickly.
At least that's the argument. And that's really what you think of when we do congressional oversight. It's because you are living in this world of invisibility. And the way I really think about it is, if you don't have to provide a good answer or reason, sooner or later, you won't have a good reason. And that's really at the heart of congressional oversight. It's how do we make sure that the people we are giving this magic ring to, this invisibility cloak to, do the right thing, and do the right thing in our name. Because at the end of the day, they're doing it on behalf of the United States. And a lot of us won't necessarily know what they're doing. We have to have somebody out there who says, hey, we see what you're doing. We want to make sure it's right, and you're doing it correctly in our name. And that's really, if you take away anything from this, this is the point of congressional oversight. So let's just take a step back and try to figure out what's going on. So who is the intelligence community? So everyone knows the big one. You know, the first one on everyone's mind, the NGA, the National Geospatial Intelligence Association, or the CIA. Maybe that's the one you know more. Right, you got the CIA. So what does the CIA do? Anyone can just reach out. Who do they do? What do they, when you think of CIA, what do they specialize in? What? Yeah? Gather, in what way do they do it, though? Everyone on this list is going to gather foreign intelligence, because if they don't, they're going to run into problems. How do they do it? What's the word that everyone knows? Spies. Who are spies? People. When you think CIA, what they actually do, their main mission is called human intelligence. It's recruiting spies. Right? Back during the Cold War, they would find somebody high up in the Communist Party, they'd recruit them, and that person would become the spy, and that's how we'd get information, intelligence, human. What's another agency in the IC, in the intelligence community? We've all heard about this past year. NSA. Who are they? What type of intelligence do they do? Do they run assets? Do they run sources? Are they human? Yeah. Say it again? What are signals intelligence? Yeah. Anything that goes over the airwaves, any type of signal, they will get, right? HUMINT, SIGINT. You do have NRO, National Reconnaissance Office. Who are they? Most people don't know about them. They're the satellite people. So they're the eyes in the sky, so they run all the U.S. Satellites, collecting intelligence that way. NGA we talked about. And you have 17 members of the U.S. intelligence community, right? I listed most of them here. They all technically work for the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence. I think your speaker, John Negroponte, will be here. He was, I think, the first DNI, or the second. And then within the Department of Defense, DOD, you have NSA, NGA, NRO, DIA, which is the Defense Intelligence Agency, Service Intel, so Air Force Intel, Navy Intel, Army Intel. That all counts. State Department as an intel arm, Treasury has an intel arm, FBI, of course, and the Department of Homeland Security. Hundreds of thousands of employees, billions of dollars. Hundreds of thousands of employees, billions of dollars. And they are overseen by the House Intelligence, Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. How many employees do you think those two have combined? Hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands? Yeah, exactly. Maybe at most, if you combine the members and the staff, you'd probably add 100. And you're talking a couple of $1 million. So how are we able to oversee 17 organizations with hundreds of thousands of employees doing things around the world 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, almost completely in the shadows? That's really what we're going to be talking about today. And these two committees, they arose precisely because of that Ring of Gyges problem. Right? In the 70s, they came about, including one of the biggest, which was Watergate. Right? Because they were using the spy agencies domestically, something you were definitely not allowed to do. Because if nobody knows about it, like we talked about right in that second slide, if you don't have to provide reasons, sooner or later you don't have good reasons. And this is what happens. So Congress went about and set these two committees up. But still, how are they going to be able, how are we going to be able to oversee everything that the IC does? One big way is, maybe the best way to think about it is this. I don't know the population of Provo, but you have a police force here, right? Do you need to have one police per person to keep that individual safe? No, right? The very fact that you know a police might be around the corner is enough maybe to deter crime. And that's some way to think about it. There is not one for one. We cannot watch everything that's going on. But you have to tell us everything that's going on, and we can ask any question that we want. So I'll start at this sort of foundational. This comes from the National Security Act of 1947 that really restructured the entire intelligence and defense community of the United States. The President shall ensure that the Congressional Intelligence Committees are kept fully and currently informed of the intelligence activities of the United States, including any significant anticipated intelligence activity as required by this title. So help me unpack this. What's going on here? Who is required to tell the Congressional Intelligence Committees? CIA? NSA? DOD, DIA, NRO, NGA? No, you're shaking your head. Who is?
President.
Why the President?
Because he can declare military action, not declare war, but he can declare military action for a number of days and things before getting it approved.
Right. And who's the President's boss? Other than the people, obviously. There is nobody higher, right? Who's the boss of the CIA? The Director of Central Intelligence, but who's his boss? The President. Who's SecDef's boss? Secretary of Defense boss? The President. So let's say you were CIA, you were DNI, you were NSA. You could say, well, I didn't tell Congress because I thought DOD was telling Congress. Oh, I didn't tell DOD. Oh, I thought NSA was going to tell it. I thought NGA was going to tell it. Here we avoid that problem and say, you Mr. or Madam President, you go figure out who's going to tell it, but you are going to tell it. You can tell your people to tell us, but ultimately, as they say, the buck stops here. So the president shall ensure. Should or shall? Is this optional? No. Shall keep the congressional intelligence committees are kept how informed? Fully, and at some point in the future, at some point? No, currently. There is no wiggle room here. Or maybe there is, we'll get back to that. Are kept fully and currently informed of the intelligence activities of the United States, including any significant anticipated intelligence activities. So what does the president, or via the CIA, what does he have to say? Anytime he does an intelligence activity? Look at what it says. Yes, everything. Because look at that last part, including any significant anticipated intelligence activity. What is that? So if it's anticipated, if it hasn't happened yet, does the director of the CIA have to tell Congress yet? Only if it's what? Significant. So after it's happened, you've got to tell everything. Before it's happened, well, only if it's significant. So I was talking to about 200 European parliamentarians last week. So the German representative, he stood straight up. What do you think he asked about? The German. What has been going on with Germany with us? Yes, exactly. He stood up and he said in an accent which I will not try to replicate, he said, would Congress consider tapping Angela Merkel's phone as significant? What do you think? Is that significant? We have one very strong, well, yes, it is. We in Congress thought it did. The president didn't think it was that significant. Well, the president's argument was, well, one, you want us to know what everything is going on around the world. You don't want to know exactly where we place the microphone. Is it behind that plant? Is it behind in this cell phone? Is it in that microphone? But you just know that you're getting information, so you should have figured out where you got the information from. Congress said no. We want to know next time you're doing that. But notice the second part. What does this say here? Even though you're required to talk about any significant anticipated intelligence activity, does that mean Congress gets to approve what you do? So let's say CIA was going to go, hey, we're going to go listen to hypothetical Chancellor X's phone. Could Congress then say, or the intelligence committees then say no? What do you think? You were so pretty sure last time. What do you think? Says nothing. Did you skip over some words there? Read, what did you say? You said nothing shall require approval. What does it actually say? Nothing in this. Ah. So you're right. Nothing in this title. But maybe it's somewhere else. Could be somewhere else. It could not be. We'll get to that. But this is the kind of games I guarantee you are going to be played all the time. The intelligence community will parse every single word, which is what we're going to do here. So nothing in this title shall be construed as requiring the approval of the intelligence committees before you go do it. But there are ways, and I will tell you that there are ways that Congress can say, hey, realize you can do this. I know it's legal, but it's a very bad idea. There are also going to be ways that they can say, I know you can do this no matter, even if we say it's a bad idea, but we have ways to make sure that you don't. We'll get to there in a minute. Somebody's reading this a long time. We talked about this. Do people know what a covert action is? What's a covert action? We talked about regular intelligence, and this is saying covert actions are completely different than regular intelligence. Anyone know an historical example? I got to be very careful here, obviously. Historical example of a covert action? Yes, sir. Perfect. That's the one I had right here. Perfect. No, not up here in my notes. Yeah, exactly. No, you got it. Exactly. What was the Bay of Pigs and what was the CIA's involvement in the Bay of Pigs?
So the CIA
What was the point of that covert operation? What were they trying to get done in Cuba?
Trying to change the regime.
Perfect. They were not just listening. They were not just trying to find out what Castro was doing. They were actually training surrogate forces to overthrow, which is a huge deal. And how are they do? Were they going to do it in a way that says, hey, the U.S. did this?
No, it wasn't supposed to be known.
Exactly. And that's what a covert action is. It's the most secret of the secret. It is an activity, like the Bay of Pigs, designed to influence political, economic, or military conditions abroad. Do you think staging a coup was big influence on political, military, and economic conditions? Absolutely. Where it is intended that the role of the United States government will not be apparent or acknowledged publicly. So this is doing something in our name but where our name is completely left out of it. Think back to the Ring of Gyges. This is not just watching, seeing, listening. This is actually changing something. This is perhaps leading a coup effort. This is a huge deal. It's going to require the utmost secrecy, because if it doesn't, it's, well, as we learned in the Bay of Pigs, it was a complete failure and set back, obviously, Cuba relations for decades to this day. That's how important this stuff is. But still, because it's so important and because it has to be so secret, we still have the same problem of the Ring of Gyges or Harry Potter's cloak. Somebody needs to know about it. Somebody needs to make sure that there are good reasons for this. And that's why they've set up special procedures for us on the intelligence committees to actually see these things. We're going to come back to things that it's not in a minute. So we set up these requirements. So now the president can't just do what he or she does in the movies and just says, go do it. He actually has to write it down. He actually says, this is exactly what you can do. This is exactly what you must do as you are doing it. And set out very, very, very specific in these things called findings. And these findings have to be handed not only to the CIA, but to whom? Who do you think? Yeah. We have to see those findings. What are the worries? Why is the president, they finally agreed to this. Obviously, the president signed this into law. If you were, ma'am, if you were president, oh, you like the idea of that. I see that. I see you taking notes. If I were president, and the CIA director worked for you, and you wanted to do a covert action, and your lawyers came up to you and said, yes, you can do this, ma'am, but you're going to have to tell Congress. What are you thinking? What are you worried about?
I am worried that it's going to get out.
Big time.
That somebody that's involved in this situation is going to find out about it before it happens, and it will be a failure.
So we made an accommodation for you, Madam President. We said, okay, there are, let's say, there's about 21 members of Congress on our House Intel Committee. Maybe that's still too many people, and there's, you know, what is it, about 13, 14 on the Senate side. Maybe that's still too many. Have you ever heard this term, the Gang of Eight? This is the accommodation. We say, okay, you're so worried? Fine. But we still have to watch you. So now all you have to do is you don't have to report it to the full committees. You have to report it to the Gang of Eight, which are the chair and the ranking members of the House and the Senate Intel Committees, and basically congressional leadership, Speaker Boehner, Leader Pelosi, Harry Reid. You have to tell those people. And then 180 days later, you still have to tell everybody else. Because ultimately we thought, really, when this was going on, you know, the president came and said, I don't want to tell anybody about this. It's that secret, it's that important. You saw what happened with Bay of Pigs. It was a complete failure. But Congress pushed back and say, hey, somebody's got to see it. We'll allow you to have fewer people, but somebody's got to see it. So that's the Gang of Eight. Sometimes you'll hear this a lot. The president briefed congressional leadership on something. They won't tell you what, obviously. But this is usually what it's referring to. Now, you were the president a moment ago. Now you are Speaker Boehner. You're in receipt of this information that you and only 7 other people have outside of the president and the people who are going to be doing this covert action. What is your worry now? You have this information. The president says, this is what I'm about to do in the Bay of Pigs.
Well, if I don't agree with it, or I think there's going to be some problem with it, I feel like later, if it doesn't work out, it's going to come back against me because I knew.
Perfect. Does that make sense to everybody? Because you're not asking my permission, you're just telling me, which now means if it goes south, me as now I'm the president say, hey, I told you about it. So Congress sometimes doesn't love this stuff because it puts them in a very awkward position. Some things have been playing out like this now. I don't want to get to too many details, but where the argument was, hey, you knew about this. You didn't stop me. But that was why I asked one of those questions before, well, can you stop me if I'm the president? We'll get to how maybe Speaker Boehner can say, hey, look, I know I can't legally stop you because of what that says, but I've got other ways to express my sincere displeasure, which may make you think twice. And I want to make one other point before we get there, and this is really important. This is extremely important. Something like this underlies what we've been going on the past year about domestic spying. Because at least for a covert action, notice right there in black and white, no covert action may be conducted which is intended to influence United States political processes, public opinion, policies, or the media. Why not? Why is this a bad thing? Why do we want the CIA manipulating our media if I'm the president? Why is that a bad thing? Can I ask you, who did a great prayer in the beginning?
I don't, just besides the fact that it seems to like impede our just basic rights of being able to choose.
Absolutely. It's the most un-American thing we could think of. Running a covert action in the United States, manipulating U.S. public opinion. Has it happened before? Yes. Watergate, right? Those kind of things. That's why we have these committees. That's why we put it in black and white. Lest anyone make any question about it, it's in black and white. You are not running CIA operations in the United States. Huge deal. You're not running media as sources. No way. To put it in a word, it is just one of the most un-American things you can think of. Okay, we've been talking about covert actions. Who normally does covert actions? What agency? Does it have to be the CIA? It's remarkably slow, this thing. No, it doesn't have to be the CIA, right? It says if the president wants to run a covert action, the president can assign it to anybody he or she wants. He can have the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development run a covert action. Be a little bit strange, but you could. I don't know if it happened over the summer, and since you got us on Cuba, it got me thinking about it. There was a AP news article, series of news articles that came out in about June or July that said that USAID, USAID, I'm sure you all know that, it works for the State Department, was, according to this newspaper series, was sending out Twitter messages in Cuba, but not saying it was the United States sending out these Twitter messages. So they were using contractors to send out messages on behalf of the United States government saying overthrow Castro, overthrow the Castro regime, but not attributing it to the United States. Would that meet the definition of a covert action? You're shaking your head, yes? Why?
Because it's not supposed to be traced back to the U.S.
And what is it designed to do?
To influence the political situation.
Exactly. But it's not the CIA doing it. So, since you just now know this, what is required before you can run a covert action? And a covert influence campaign is part of covert action. What is required? What is the president required to do?
Notify select members of Congress.
In what form? Verbally?
Written.
Ah, yes. So there must be a written finding. And the point of this article was, where's the finding? So they would call up and say, hey, I know it's classified, you can't talk about the existence or findings, but they said, hey, if this were a covert action, you would be required to know about it and see something in writing. And we said, yes. But here, of course, we don't, USAID doesn't come to us, right? We get CIA, NSA, DIA, NGA, we get a little bit of state, but not USAID. And so this is a real problem. And that's why Senator Leahy, when he looked at this, said, look, maybe you guys have a legal argument that this is not illegal, but let me just tell you something. It's dumb. Running a covert action completely off the books that obviously the media finds out about. And it's not done because they don't have they don't have a way to also keep secrecy. So it's important to realize that CIA doesn't necessarily have to be the only one who does covert actions. Others can do it, but you still have to follow all the rules. And the most important rule is you got to let somebody know about it. So people on the foreign affairs side are saying, hey, we didn't know about this. And the intel people are saying, hey, we didn't know about this. These guys shouldn't be doing this kind of stuff. And that's where you run into that problem of congressional oversight, where there's a seam that apparently somebody was trying to exploit. Who else? I heard it before. Who else can run a covert action that might be very good at it? The military, right? Anyone know the difference between a clandestine and a covert operation? Covert, we now know, is what? It's not only secret, but what is the intent about U.S. involvement? It doesn't exist. Right? A clandestine is something the military does every day. That's just secret. But that the military, if asked, would tell you, yes, we did it. That is one of the most strangely sophisticated distinctions that you now have. It's amazing how many people talk for weeks and months about this Title 10, Title 50 distinction. But one of the two big points I'm going to say about it is, one, covert versus clandestine is attribution. And number two, it's all about Congress. The Title 10, Title 50 distinction about who goes after bin Laden, right? Remember, maybe, I don't know. Who goes after bin Laden? We'll leave it at that. Is it the military acting under Title 10? Is it the CIA acting under Title 50? It's really a matter of who gets to see it. Right? If the CIA does something, which committees get to see it? We do. If the military does something, which committees get to see it? The Intelligence or the Armed Services Committees? The Armed Services Committees. And that is a lot of what this distinction breaks down to. It's who gets to see it. So for example, everyone is, this time last year, everyone was trying to figure out what to do in Syria, right, with the chemical weapons in Syria. The Intel Committee, we had the intelligence. The Armed Services Committee had the military options on the table, and the Foreign Affairs Committees, they were trying to figure out what's the best foreign policy. But the Foreign Affairs Committee wasn't allowed to get the intel, and the Intel Committee wasn't allowed to get the diplomatic aspects. And what was the other part of the definition of covert action? What does it have to be in support of? Identifiable foreign policy objectives. And you couldn't get those identifiable foreign policy objectives briefed to us because each committee has its own jurisdiction. So a lot of this covert action, clandestine action, this huge discussion, should it be CIA, should it be DOD, really a lot of times, folks, comes down to which committee is going to oversee it. Which committee is going to have jurisdiction over this? Because let me tell you, each committee guards its jurisdiction very, very closely. And a lot of it boils down to that. So here are the other national security committees, all of which have a piece in national security. Armed services, we talked about foreign affairs. Also the appropriations committees. We're going to talk about them in the next slide. Homeland Security, obviously. Even judiciary. We talked about SIGINT, signals intelligence collected from telephones. FISA, we're going to talk about that. Everyone's been hearing all about that. That mainly is a judiciary committee thing. all these committees have a stake in what's going on. Now remember, does anyone remember what the big critique coming out of 9/11 was? Why did we not see it? You're shaking your head, sir.
Communication between agencies wasn't, I don't know, they closely guarded their secrets.
Right. It was stovepipe. It was compartmented. Nobody was sharing. Right. So after 9/11, we do this huge restructuring. Right. We create the Department of Homeland Security. We encourage and we enforce sharing between and among government agencies, so that doesn't happen again. But what's the one national security apparatus that didn't undergo any type of restructure or reorganization? Congress. So we require in all of government a holistic, comprehensive strategy, but still Congress is broken down under its old pre-9/11 distinctions and jurisdictions. And a couple more things to just bring out. This looks innocuous. Appropriated funds available may be obligated or expended for intelligence only if those funds were specifically authorized. That just sounds like a lot of words. This is hugely significant. Anyone remember Iran-Contra? No one remembers Iran-Contra? So let me see. You're already my president and John Boehner. I'm going to go to you, sir. You are my head of CIA. You are the John Brennan. What would you prefer? I give you $1 billion and you go do with it whatever you like? Or I give you $10 million here and I want you to do this, $10 million here to do that, all the way up to $1 billion. What would you prefer?
Being the one to be able to make the decisions, I'd like to choose what I want to do.
Sure, who wouldn't want just a pot of money and go spend it any way you like, right? In fact, that was, in a sense, what was going on with the Iran-Contra. In a sense, they were taking money out of one account and secretly funneling it to do something completely different. Congress is basically saying, here, take this money. They were like, got it, but I'm secretly taking the money and doing something else and not telling Congress about it. And that's why they put something else like this in there. That says, okay, you may have the money, but you can only spend it on things that I have authorized, because authorizing and appropriating are done by different committees. So the authorizers, that's us, we will sit down in tremendous detail, line by line, say, you want to do this operation in Antarctica? Okay. We authorize you to spend no more than $1 million on that operation. You want to do that operation in Greenland? Okay, we're going to authorize you no more than $3 million. That goes forward, and then the appropriators look at it and say, hey, we agree, and they actually write the check. But just because sometimes you just get the check because the authorization doesn't come through, then it becomes really, really tricky. But really, you always have to look, and this is what's so important, is you need to have both an authorization and an appropriation. Otherwise, you have these huge scandals that we saw at the end of the 80s with the Iran-Contra. And this is what I was talking about. These are the authorization, the Intelligence Authorization Act, an annual bill, hopefully, that is in 3 sections, the stuff that you would see if you went online, the unclassified legislative text, then the stuff that we just see, which is the classified annex, which basically says, hey, we really support your proposed program in Antarctica. We really think you should be spending $1 million on it, and we want you to consider these 3 things while you do this. It's a very, conversational thing. And then the most important part is the classified schedule authorizations that gives you your budget. You can spend $1 million there, $1 million here, $1 million here, $1 million here. And that is one of the most effective tools of oversight that we have. That's how we know what you're doing. Not only do you have to tell us after the fact, so here you go. We can only authorize it. You can only do what we've authorized. Now, within your account, it's not going to be so specific that you can say you're going to have to do it on a Tuesday and you're going to have to do, using red color flags. right? There will be a lot of discretion, and that's where you get to the point where the president says, hey, you've given me this money to go figure out the situation in Antarctica. I've decided to use that money on a covert action. Here's the finding. Sorry, Mr. Boehner, Speaker Boehner, I know you don't agree, but I'm going to do it anyway. Okay, fine. Now, what are you going to do, Speaker Boehner? Or you're going to be my chairman of the House Intel Committee. What are you going to do? So you're going to say, no, this is the stupidest idea. I can't believe you're going to tap Angela Merkel's phone again after all this. You're going to do it again. Okay, what would you do? Now, what do you have the power to do?
I'm hoping you're going to tell me.
What do you think? You're at Congress. What is the one thing you have that the president doesn't have? The power of the what? Yes. Authorize the budget, which is another way of saying you got the money. The president can't do anything without money. So sure, they can use the money that's already been appropriated, but what you guys are going to do is say, all right, you want to defy us? Fine. See how much you're getting next year. 0. And that's how you can control the executive branch, is the power of the purse. You can put restrictions on funds. You can do all kinds of things about money. So you want this money? I'm going to give it to you, yes. But it's going to have, we're going to write in the law that you can only use this money if you do X. If you come to me to say you have the nicest tan every day for the next 3 weeks. You can put anything you want in there. It's a little silly, but you can. You can write whatever you want because you control the money. And the money is what they need to do any of these operations. So while nothing in this title in the 1947 National Security Act says that the Congress has to approve of what you're doing, you still control the funds. And there's a whole bunch of other oversight mechanisms. We have people coming in. You've seen it on TV all the time. I mean, usually you won't see ours, but you will see, you know, Secretary Kerry come up being sworn in and have to ask a question. Secretary Hagel, same way. Director Brennan is constantly in and testifying before us. Hearings, briefing, roundtables, these things called inspector generals. This is like internal affairs and cop shows. And within each agency, they're investigating themselves. GSA, these are more auditors, think tanks, the press, huge source of oversight. That helps us a lot. Meetings, constituent meetings, meetings like these. The ideas that come out of these, you'll see how they get translated into oversight. And we just talked about end payback. You want to do something that we don't like? Fine. See what happens in the next Intelligence Authorization Act. That's the biggest way to ensure that we get that access, that insight. And there's specific oversight. How many people remember what just happened? I think it was June. Sergeant Bergdahl. You're shaking your head. What happened with Sergeant Bergdahl? What did the president do?
Is that the trade?
Yes.
Traded, like,
Taliban 5. For whom?
one United States soldier who, I don't know for sure, but it was talked about that he may have even deserted, so there's big controversy.
Right. So the president took 5 people out of Gitmo in exchange for one of our soldiers. Okay. Problem with that was a specific provision, not in the Intelligence Authorization Act, not in the National Security Act of 1947, but the National Defense Authorization Act, which says, fine, if you want to do that, you have to certify some things, and you have to tell whom 30 days in advance? Congress. The huge uproar came out of that because the president arguably didn't tell Congress 30 days before. And believe me, none of this, I mean, talk about payback. There's so much payback after that now. There's so much payback going on now. The president had arguments, and some of them were good arguments. But at the same time, Congress is not a court of law. It could just felt, you know what? Fine, you have a legal argument? Great. You still should have told us. It's payback time. Believe me, getting dragged up on the Hill to testify in front of an angry Congress, that's huge. And to have it, we did it every week. That was our payback. Okay, fine. We are calling each of you in every week. Anyone who had anything to do with this, we're bringing you in. And here's another one. I know we're going to have some questions on this. This is just saying, on an annual basis, the AG shall fully inform us concerning all requests for the production of tangible things under Section 501 of this Act. Any guesses what tangible things under Section 501 of this Act is? Maybe something you've heard about nonstop for over a year? What was the big leak? What was the big revelation in June of last year? Yes. That's Snowden. And what did he reveal? This is great. I mean, bring this up. I thought I was going to get drilled. This is the telephone metadata. This is the telephone surveillance program. That's what this is. This is the business records. This is the big one. Does everyone know how that sort of works? This is, now it's all obviously unclassified. This is the bulk collection of every number called to every other number, time, date, duration of call, into NSA, at which point NSA would query, would search that database to find potential terrorist links. We knew about it because it was in the law saying you had to tell us about it at least every year. And this is what I mean. So how the oversight works is obviously Snowden released all this stuff. It became a huge deal. We all, the members, all of us had many meetings like this, many meetings with constituents, many meetings with business interests, media, nonstop for over a year. And for example, I just use this as an example, and the House passed the USA Freedom Act, which scaled back the bulk collection of all metadata. We don't need to go into detail on this unless you're interested in it, but this was one of the biggest examples of intelligence community oversight in years, since 9/11. So the last thing I will just say is, and why these, I love coming out to do these, especially here because this is just one of the more sophisticated institutions in international affairs. The ranking member means the senior most member of Congress on a committee from the minority party. So for the Intel committee, the ranking member is the senior most Democrat on the Intel committee. He gave a speech last Friday and he said, as a leader, it's really important to lift your head up every now and again and say, okay, things are working well, but how can they be made better? How can we improve things? Yes, things are working very well. The House, we think the Intel Committee does excellent oversight on behalf of the American people, but can it be done better? And that was the question he asked, and that's the question I want to ask you today. As you think through this, and as you know, obviously some of you guys are going to go potentially into the intelligence community. As I said earlier, the one organization that's hugely involved in national security that hasn't changed since 9/11 is Congress. And I just took one report that said the existing committee structure does not allow for effective oversight of cross-cutting national security threats, such as WMD, weapons of mass destruction like nuclear, proliferation, and terrorism. Congress should reform its oversight, both structurally and substantively, to better address intelligence, homeland security, and cross-cutting national security missions. Because what I talked about before, one of the big problems with 9/11 was stovepiping. How do we avoid that in the Congress? There are many proposals that are slowly floating around, and there's always a gestation period for true reform. These things have to percolate for a while. One, for example, is a joint intelligence committee. Right, I told you there's a House and there's a Senate version, and then there's also the appropriators. If you think about it, from Director CIA's position, not only do you have to just make one call, you got to call us, you've got to call the Senate, you've got to call both sides, the majority and the minority, on both, right? Okay, that's okay for CIA, but think about for DHS, Secretary Johnson, Jay Johnson. He's got, I think it's 92 committees and subcommittees that he reports to. So he's got to make 92 calls, at least. That's a lot. That's a lot of time that you're not spending doing the stuff that keeps us safe. It's very important, and it does obviously really result in more effective intelligence collection. But there is, at some point, it gets to be too much. So one proposal is have a joint intelligence committee, bring us all together, and we'll streamline the process. We'll still get all the information, but you brief it once. You don't have to keep briefing verbatim the same thing. One option. Another is a national security committee. It's what we talked about before. Why would you have the people who do foreign affairs on Syria not being given the intelligence on Syria? Why give the people who get the intelligence on Syria, we need to know, well, what are the identifiable foreign policy objectives? That's the law. So why not just have one committee of armed services, intelligence, and foreign affairs? Maybe that's another one. And the last one is combined intelligence authorizing and appropriations committee, right? You got to go through this process, this huge process twice, not only to authorize, we talk about, but also to appropriate. And every time you do something like that, people can offer up amendments on all kinds of random things. And so we return to where we began. How do we make sure we see into a largely invisible world? And believe me, the world is getting even more invisible. Right? Intelligence is such a technical game these days. Signals intelligence, plucking things out of the air, satellites. I mean, really, every time I get read into something, I think it is going to be what really happened at Area 51. And it's usually just some frequency that they're operating on. But it's apparently very, very secretive. But it's so important. How do we make sure we see into a largely invisible world? And I think what's most important, especially after this year, is how do we do things on behalf of the American people, as well as our allies and friends, consistent with our values? Right? We talked about certainly spying within the United States. That is certainly un-American. But certain things that we do overseas also has to be consistent with our values. And it's a very difficult conversation to have when the American people don't know what we're doing. So we have to have a very developed oversight mechanism that does represent American values and does represent the American people. And those are the intelligence committees, which maybe you may decide you want to reform. So I leave you with one last thing. It's something as I was walking out of the building in the Capitol on Tuesday, I just randomly passed by and I thought, this is it. This is exactly what I want to talk about today. It's by Justice Louis Brandeis. He writes, "Men born to freedom are naturally alert to repel invasion of their liberty by evil-minded rulers. The greatest dangers to liberty lurk in insidious encroachment by men of zeal, well-meaning, but without understanding." And take a second to think what he's saying. Coincidentally, or maybe as it is meant to be, this actually comes from opinion on wiretapping. Olmsted, I think it was 1928, one of the earliest wiretapping cases. So it was potentially an espionage case, but it was, you know. And what is his point here? What can you see? What is the point? And I think it really harkens back to something you said in your opening prayer, which is why it really hit me. It sort of reverberated true for me. What did you sort of pray for is have a deeper understanding. And I think that is the key to true intelligence oversight, is you need to not only have the members and the staff who really have to understand what's going on and obviously be told what's going on, but the American people have to understand what's going on. Not the classified necessarily, but as much as possible. As we've seen over this past year with the leaks, when we were talking about, everyone was talking past each other. Are we spying abroad, spying at home with this telephone metadata? Are we collecting content? No, we're not collecting content. But really the only true way we can ensure that we're doing it right and doing it consistent with our values is to have talks like these, to have discussions like these, a dialogue, so it's better understanding on both of our parts. So I know we have some time for some questions. I'll turn to Reem.
So now some of you may have to run to your next class, but we will take a few minutes for questions. We just ask you to go up to the mic. Tell us your name and what you're studying. And as you're coming up to the mic, I'll just start off. This summer we also learned from the Inspector General CIA report that CIA had been conducting some kind of oversight on the Oversight Committee. And I guess looking back on Watergate and these and FISA and the origins of the National Security Law or Act, how do you view that, and what can you say about that? Because it seems to me that even more than the recent revelations has the propensity to make Americans very concerned about how that oversight can happen if those that have the tools are using them against those who are overseeing them.
Yeah, I think it's very fair to say that that was a huge deal when that came out. You know, we talked about spying on the United States. That's really bad. Spying on Congress is like spying on the United States. It is, right? Because Congress is a representative of the American people, and I think that's the real way to think about it. I know Director Brennan apologized profusely. He said he did not know about that. It was, you know, one thing we also need to keep in mind, it's certainly people within hundreds of thousands of employees will do bad things, and they will do things that are illegal. What's important, of course, is that we find it right away and that there are no systemic problems. But I think that rattled a lot of us, and I think as well it should. And we really need to be on guard against that. But again, it's like I said at the very beginning, hundreds of thousands of employees, billions of dollars, they have to tell us everything, or we have to also really know what questions to ask. But could they hide something from Congress? We've seen it before. Yes, they can. But you will get caught. Eventually you will get caught.
Please.
So my name's Amy Lambert. I'm a Latin American Studies major. So just going off what you just said, how can you ensure that you do get all the information when they come to you telling you this is what we're going to do or this is what we did and why? How do you know that you're getting the full story?
That's a great question. And there's an art to that. It's sort of like I was a prosecutor as well. So it was like when I interviewed witnesses. You really listen to what they're saying and you start to say, you know what, that doesn't really fully make sense. What are you not telling us? And you really have to pull that thread. What helps, though, is we keep everything. So before those people come in, I'm sitting there reading all their previous stuff. And and it's happened a bunch that, you know what, in 2006, you told us about this program. You haven't told us about it again in 4 years. Is it still going on? Oh, yes, but we didn't think you wanted to know about it. Why? We asked you the question. Well, you asked it this way, and it's answering it this way. And those are kind of, I don't want to say games, but that's the kind of things you really have to be alert for. You really have to know how to ask the right questions. You've got to do a lot of study. And can people hide things from you? Sure, that's what they're trained to do. But eventually you will get caught because you have so many people looking and prying. And also, if you get on a scent, you never let it go until right? You can usually tell if there's something not being told to you, and then that's exactly where you need to go and look for it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and then one follow-up question. How do you ensure that the members of these oversight committee don't have any bias or loyalty to people within these intelligence communities? How do you keep them free and clear of any cross-loyalties?
Another great question. I think that's something people said this past year after Snowden, is that the intelligence communities are so tight, they're cozy up to the intelligence community. And that is a risk, because as soon as you are read into something that only a couple of people know, it's a natural bonding experience, right? It's sort of, you're in the secret club that only the gang of 8 and a couple other know. And again, it's like, I consider it like being a board of directors to a CEO. You need to maintain that distance. You have a fiduciary duty. You have a duty to the American people to do so. It is tough, but you just have to constantly sort of work on it. And every member I've seen, even if they are closed on a particular subject because they want this certain satellite built, that doesn't mean that on a totally separate issue, they're not going to really ask the hard questions. But you're right, it's something you always have to be on guard against.
Right. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Any other questions? Please.
My name is Travis Dolney, and I'm a geography major. And I was curious to get your take as you kind of explain the reporting requirements under the National Security Act. One thing that stuck out to me is that since 1947, the size and scope of U.S. intelligence operations has certainly grown dramatically, and it seems to me that if the standard is to keep Congress abreast of really everything that the intelligence community is doing, it seems to me to likely indicate an incredible amount of information and disclosure. How do you reconcile that? How much of the congressional response is legitimate outrage, not being informed, and how much might be cover? Because as you say, if you're not informed, you get to live in ignorance as to some of these operations that might be potentially embarrassing or have been backfires or failures for the country.
Another great question. And you're right. There's a way you can hide disclosure within disclosures, right? If you turn over hundreds of pages of documents and page 291 is the juicy part, yeah, you fulfilled your requirements to disclose, but somebody's got to read all 291 pages of very tedious stuff to get there. So in one sense, yeah, because the size and scope of intelligence activities has grown so much, almost counterintuitively, even though the disclosure requirements have increased, the ability to oversee has become more difficult because there's just so much more stuff. Like I got to report, 215 pages on FISA semi-annually, so I get that twice a year. And that's just on one program within FISA. And it makes it very, very difficult. But again, what's really important also is your staff. Like, we have people who had done FISA for the Department of Justice, so they know exactly what to look for. They know exactly where to go. It's sometimes the idea that former players make the best coaches, right, because they know what to look for. Or the best defense attorneys were former prosecutors. There's a lot of that. But you're right, it's an ongoing tension. That is what it's all about. How do you do effective oversight over worldwide, enormous intelligence activities? And they are following law and telling you about everything, but there's so much, which does give people the cover to say, yeah, you never told me. Or you never really explained to me what it was. And I think you saw that from members of Congress on this metadata program. They voted on it twice. They had voted on it just the year before. But they said, we didn't understand the full size and scope of that. Right? And, any other questions? No, thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you.